The video ended. Margaret played it 3 times, searching Richard's face for hidden messages, for signs of torture or duress beyond the obvious stress. He appeared physically intact. A second email arrived. This one contained text instructions. The ransom was to be assembled in cash, small bills, non-sequential. They had 72 hours. Further instructions would follow. Any contact with law enforcement would result in Richard's immediate execution. "We're calling the FBI," David said firmly. "These threats are standard. They're designed to isolate you and prevent professional intervention." Margaret looked at Marcus, then at John. Atlas sat beside her chair, his dark eyes watching everyone in the room. She thought about Richard's face in the video, about 25 years of marriage, about the life they had built together. "Make the call," she said finally. Within 2 hours, 2 FBI agents arrived at the estate. Special Agent Sarah Reeves was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed and efficient. Her partner, Agent Michael Torres, was younger, but carried himself with quiet competence. They set up equipment in the study, recording devices and tracking software for any future communications. "The video shows he's alive and currently unharmed," Reeves said, reviewing the footage on her laptop. "The production quality suggests they have experience. The room appears to be residential, possibly a rental property or foreclosed home. We're running the video through enhancement software to identify any background details." "What are his chances?" Margaret asked directly. Reeves met her eyes. "Statistically, ransom kidnappings of high-net-worth individuals in the United States have a 78% positive resolution rate when law enforcement is involved early. The kidnappers appear professional, which paradoxically works in our favor. Professionals want the money, not violence. Violence complicates their extraction and increases their risk." Margaret found small comfort in statistics. Richard was not a statistic. He was her husband. Atlas had been watching the agents since they arrived, his posture alert but not aggressive. The dog had been trained to distinguish between authorized visitors and threats. The agents' calm demeanor and Margaret's acceptance of their presence signaled to Atlas that these people were pack allies. "Can you assemble the ransom amount?" Torres asked. David Chen nodded. "It will require liquidating some assets, securing short-term loans against properties, and withdrawing maximum amounts from various accounts. 3 days is tight but possible. We don't recommend paying the ransom without attempting a rescue operation," Reeves said. "Once you pay, you lose all leverage. There's no guarantee they'll release him." "And if we don't pay?" Marcus asked, his voice hard. "Then we focus entirely on locating him before the deadline expires," Reeves said. "We're already analyzing the abduction site, reviewing security footage, running the van's description through traffic cameras. These operations require planning, which means the kidnappers left traces." Margaret stood and walked to the window. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Richard should be here, watching this sunset, with her discussing the Riverside deal, planning their weekend. Instead, he was in some concrete room, bound to a chair surrounded by armed criminals. Atlas followed her to the window, pressing against her leg again. She reached down and stroked the dog's head. Richard had insisted on buying Atlas, on spending $75,000 for a trained protection dog. At the time, it had seemed excessive. Now, with Richard gone, Atlas represented security, constancy, protection. "We'll prepare the ransom as backup," Margaret decided. "But you pursue every investigative lead. I want my husband back alive." Reeves nodded. "We'll set up a command post here. With your permission, we'll monitor all communications and coordinate with local law enforcement. We'll need access to Richard's financial records, business dealings, any recent conflicts or disputes." The investigation began in earnest. Agents reviewed Richard's calendar, his emails, his business transactions. They interviewed Marcus and John repeatedly, extracting every detail about the kidnapping. They contacted the office building's security, collected footage from surrounding businesses, tracked the white van through traffic camera networks. Night fell. Emily called from Stanford, sobbing. Margaret tried to comfort her daughter while maintaining her own composure. She told Emily to stay at school, to let the professionals handle this. to pray for her father's safety. Marcus refused to leave the estate. He slept in his old bedroom, the room he had grown up in before college. John remained as well, feeling personally responsible for Richard's abduction, despite everyone's assurances that he had been outgunned and outmaneuvered. Margaret lay awake. In the master bedroom, Richard's side of the bed empty and cold. Atlas had followed her upstairs, an unusual behavior. Normally the dog slept in his kennel in the utility room. Tonight, Atlas positioned himself beside the bed, his presence a small comfort in the darkness. She thought about Richard in that concrete room. Was he sleeping? Was he afraid? Did he know that everyone who loved him was working frantically to bring him home? The helplessness crushed her, the inability to do anything but wait and hope. Downstairs, the FBI agents worked through the night, building their case, tracking leads, preparing for whatever came next. The 72-hour clock was ticking, each minute bringing them closer to an unknown resolution. Richard spent his first night in captivity on a thin mattress in the corner of the concrete room. They had removed the restraints after the video recording, but a heavy chain connected his ankle to a bolt in the floor. The chain allowed him to reach a chemical toilet in another corner and access a small table where they placed food and water bottles. Sleep came in brief, troubled intervals. Every sound startled him awake. Footsteps in the hallway outside. Distant voices speaking in languages he could not identify. The creak of the building settling. He tried to track time by the light filtering through the covered window, but the plywood blocked most illumination. They brought him food twice on the first day. Sandwiches, fruit, bottled water. Nothing that required utensils that could be used as weapons. The man with neck tattoos delivered the meals, saying nothing, his expression neutral. Richard tried to engage him in conversation, but the man simply left the food and departed. Richard's mind worked constantly, analyzing his situation, searching for opportunities. The room had no obvious weaknesses. The door was solid metal with a lock on the outside. The window was too high and too small to offer escape, even if he could remove the plywood. The chain on his ankle was industrial grade, the bolt set deep in concrete. He thought about Margaret constantly. She would be terrified, probably blaming herself somehow despite the situation being entirely beyond her control. He thought about Marcus, who had witnessed the kidnapping. The trauma would stay with his son for years. He thought about Emily, who would hear the news at Stanford and feel helpless so far from home. On the second day, the older man with the cultured accent returned. He brought a folding chair and sat across from Richard, maintaining a conversational distance. He offered Richard a cigarette, which Richard declined. "Your family is cooperating," the man said. "The FBI is involved as we expected. They are attempting to trace our communications, track financial movements, build a profile of our operation. Standard procedure. They will not succeed in time to prevent the transaction." Richard studied the man's face, looking for tells, for weaknesses. The man appeared completely confident, utterly at ease. This was not his first kidnapping, possibly not even his 10th. "How long have you been doing this?" Richard asked. The man smiled slightly. "Conversation makes captivity more bearable, doesn't it? I understand the impulse. However, I cannot provide information that might assist law enforcement. I can tell you that we are professionals. We have never harmed a client who cooperated with our process. You will be released unharmed once payment is confirmed." Client. The word choice struck Richard as deliberately clinical, removing humanity from the transaction. He was not a kidnapped victim, but a client in a business dealing. "What if my family cannot raise the money in time?" Richard asked. "They can," the man said with certainty. "We researched your finances thoroughly before selecting you. Your company's assets alone exceed $400 million. $10 million is achievable within our time frame. Your family's cooperation indicates they understand this." The thoroughness chilled Richard. These people had studied him, calculated his net worth, assessed the feasibility of ransom payment before ever approaching him. He was a target selected through careful analysis. Inside the van, they were pushed to the floor. A cloth bag went over Richard's head, blocking his vision. He heard similar treatment for Marcus and John. The van doors slammed shut and the vehicle lurched forward. Richard tried to control his breathing. Panic would not help. He needed to stay calm, think clearly, remember details. The FBI would want information. Margaret would need him to survive this. The van made several turns, left then right then left again. Richard tried to track their direction but quickly lost orientation. They drove for what felt like an hour, though his distorted time sense made accurate estimates impossible. When the van finally stopped, rough hands pulled them out. Richard stumbled on what felt like gravel, then was walked forward. A door opened and he was pushed inside. The temperature dropped, suggesting they were now indoors, possibly a warehouse or garage. Someone removed the bag from his head. Richard blinked in the dim light, adjusting to a large empty space with concrete floors and metal walls. Industrial shelving lined one wall. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows. Marcus and John stood nearby, their bags also removed. John's face was swelling from the pistol strike, his nose clearly broken. Marcus looked terrified, his eyes wide and hands trembling despite the zip ties. "Sit," one of the masked men ordered, pointing to 3 metal chairs arranged in the center of the space. They obeyed. Richard studied the men, looking for identifying features. All wore gloves, masks, and dark clothing that revealed nothing distinctive. Their builds varied, one tall and thin, another shorter and stocky, 2 of medium height. No visible tattoos or jewelry. Richard Henderson, the tall one said, pulling out a phone. Net worth approximately $200 million. "You're going to make a phone call to your wife. You're going to tell her to prepare $10 million in cash. No police, no FBI, no tricks. You have 48 hours, $10 million. The number hit Richard like a physical blow. He had the money, could access it through various accounts and liquid assets, but assembling that much cash in 2 days presented enormous logistical challenges. "I need to speak with my bank," Richard said, trying to keep his voice steady. $10 million in cash requires advance notice. Banks don't keep that much on hand. "Your problem," the man said. "Solve it, or we start sending pieces of your son to your wife." Marcus made a strangled sound. Richard's protective instincts surged, overwhelming his fear. "Don't touch him. I'll get the money. Just don't hurt anyone." The tall man seemed satisfied. He approached Richard with a different phone, a cheap burner model. "You get 1 call. Make it count. Convince her. Any hint of police and you all die here." Richard nodded. His mind raced through possible approaches. Margaret would be frantic when she received this call, but she was also intelligent and strong. She would hold together long enough to do what needed to be done. The man dialed and held the phone to Richard's ear. It rang 3 times. Then Margaret's voice worried. "Hello? Margaret, it's me. Listen carefully. I need you to stay calm." Richard kept his voice as level as possible, fighting the tremor threatening to break through. "Richard? Whose number is this?" "Where are you?" "I'm okay. Marcus and John are with me. We're being held. They want $10 million in cash within 48 hours. No police, do you understand? No police, silence." Then a small sound, a stifled sob. "Oh God, Richard, are you hurt?" "We're okay, but you need to do exactly what they say. Call Stephen at the bank. Tell him it's an emergency acquisition. He'll help arrange the cash. Margaret, I need you to be strong right now." "Can you do that?" "Yes," her voice steadied. "Yes, I can. What else?" "Nothing else. Just the money. They'll contact you with delivery instructions. Margaret, I love you. I love you too. I'll fix this. I promise." The phone was pulled away. The call ended. Richard sagged in the chair, the brief connection to his wife leaving him simultaneously relieved and more anxious. Margaret would move heaven and earth to get that money, but the no police instruction terrified him. Without law enforcement, they had no backup, no rescue plan. "Good," the tall man said. "Now we wait." The men left through a side door, leaving Richard, Marcus, and John alone in the locked space. Richard heard a heavy bolt slide into place. "Dad, I'm sorry," Marcus whispered. "If I hadn't suggested this meeting—" "Stop," Richard cut him off. "This isn't your fault. These men targeted us. They knew our schedule, our patterns. This was planned." John finally spoke, his voice nasally from the broken nose. "He's right. They had too much information. They knew which parking level, which time. Someone's been watching." The implication chilled Richard. Someone in their circle, someone with access to schedules and movements had provided intelligence to these kidnappers. The betrayal added another layer of violation to an already traumatic situation. Richard thought of Atlas, back at the estate with Margaret. The dog could not help them here. For all his training and protective instincts, Atlas was miles away, guarding an empty house while his master sat zip-tied in a warehouse, hoping his wife could somehow deliver $10 million before time ran out. Margaret Henderson received the call at 1:15 in the afternoon. She was in the garden with Atlas, watching the dog patrol the perimeter as he did every few hours. The phone showed an unknown number and something made her answer despite her usual caution with unfamiliar calls. "Mrs. Henderson," a male voice said. No accent, no emotion. "Your husband has been taken into protective custody by our organization. He is unharmed. You will receive video proof within the hour. Do not contact law enforcement if you wish to see him alive again." The phone went dead before Margaret could respond. She stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear. Atlas noticed her distress immediately, moving to her side and pressing against her leg. The dog's trained sensitivity to human emotional states made him invaluable in moments like this. Her hands shook as she dialed Marcus. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with stress. "Mom, they took him. Right in front of us, downtown. John and I are with the police now, so they already had involved law enforcement." Margaret felt relief and terror simultaneously. The FBI had experience with kidnappings, but the caller's warning echoed in her mind. She made her decision quickly. "Come home," she said. "Both of you. Right now." Within 40 minutes, Marcus and John arrived at the estate. Margaret had called their attorney, David Chen, who arrived shortly after. Atlas remained close to Margaret. His behavior shifted from routine patrol mode to active protection stance. The dog seemed to understand that the pack hierarchy had been disrupted. They gathered in Richard's study. Marcus looked pale, his earlier confidence shattered by witnessing his father's abduction. John maintained professional composure, but Margaret could see the frustration in his eyes. As a security professional, he had failed in his primary responsibility. "Tell me everything," Margaret said. Marcus recounted the kidnapping in halting sentences. 3 men, professional operation, white van, weapons drawn but not fired. The whole sequence had taken less than 30 seconds. Passers-by had barely noticed. David Chen took notes on his legal pad. He was a criminal defense attorney with connections to federal prosecutors. "The FBI needs to be involved immediately," he said. "Statistically, professional involvement increases the likelihood of successful recovery." Margaret's phone chimed. An email from an encrypted address with no subject line. She opened it and her stomach dropped. It was a video file. The video showed Richard sitting in a stark room, holding that day's Los Angeles Times with the date clearly visible. He looked tired but unharmed. He spoke in a flat voice, clearly reading from a script someone held off camera. "I am being held for ransom. The amount is $10 million. I have not been harmed and I will be released once payment is received. Margaret, please follow their instructions exactly. I love you." "The FBI advises against paying ransoms," Richard said, thinking of articles he had read about kidnapping statistics. The man nodded. "They do. Officially. Privately, they acknowledge that in cases involving professional operations, payment often represents the safest path to recovery. They will advise your family while simultaneously pursuing investigative leads. If they locate us before the deadline, they will attempt rescue. If not, they will reluctantly recommend payment." The man stood, preparing to leave. "I suggest you rest, Mr. Henderson. Stress depletes the body. You will need your strength for the journey home." After he left, Richard lay on the mattress staring at the concrete ceiling. The man's confidence suggested extensive experience. Multiple successful kidnappings established protocols for avoiding detection. The FBI was capable, but they were working against a deadline and against adversaries who had planned meticulously. Meanwhile, at the Henderson estate, the investigation intensified. Agent Reeves had established a command post in Richard's study, with laptops displaying surveillance footage, financial tracking software, and communications monitoring systems. Agent Torres worked with local police, coordinating searches of potential holding locations based on the white van's last known trajectory. Margaret sat with David Chen, reviewing the ransom assembly process. They had liquidated stocks, secured bridge loans against properties, and withdrawn maximum amounts from various accounts. The pile of cash grew in a secure room at the company's offices, guarded by private security. It was surprisingly small for $10 million. Fitting in 3 large duffel bags, Marcus worked with John, reviewing security footage frame by frame, trying to identify any detail about the kidnappers that might lead to Richard's location. They had isolated clear images of 2 of the 3 men, and the FBI was running facial recognition through databases. Atlas remained close to Margaret throughout, his protective instinct heightened by the disruption to the household routine. The dog seemed to understand that the alpha male was missing, and he adjusted his behavior accordingly, staying near Margaret whenever possible. On the evening of the second day, another email arrived. It contained GPS coordinates and instructions. The ransom would be delivered to a specific location in the Angeles National Forest at midnight on the 3rd day. One person would make the delivery, driving alone, no law enforcement tracking. They would receive confirmation of Richard's release location once the money was verified. It's a standard dead drop protocol, Reeves explained. Remote location, difficult to surveil, multiple escape routes. They'll have spotters watching the area to ensure compliance with their instructions. Can you track the money? Margaret asked. We'll mark bills and include tracking devices, but professionals check for those. They'll likely transfer the cash multiple times, washing it through various locations before final distribution. The tracking will help us eventually, but probably not in time to prevent their initial escape. Margaret felt the weight of decision pressing on her. Richard's life potentially depended on choices she made in the next 24 hours. Trust the FBI to find him, or comply with the kidnappers' demands and hope they honored their word. I'm delivering the ransom, Marcus said suddenly. It should be me. Margaret started to object, but Marcus continued. They took him in front of me. I watched and couldn't do anything. Let me do this. David Chen shook his head. Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. We'll hire a professional courier, someone with training for hostile delivery situations. But Margaret saw the determination in Marcus's face, the need to take action after days of helpless waiting. She understood because she felt the same crushing helplessness. We'll decide tomorrow, she said finally. Let's see what developments occur overnight. The night stretched long. Richard lay in his concrete room, counting the hours by his internal clock. Margaret lay in her bedroom, Atlas beside the bed, both of them awake and watchful. Marcus sat in the study with the FBI agents, monitoring communications, hoping for a breakthrough. The deadline approached, and everyone involved felt time compressing, possibilities narrowing, the moment of crisis drawing inevitable closer. The morning of the 3rd day arrived with gray skies over Los Angeles. Margaret woke early after restless sleep, Atlas still positioned beside her bed like a faithful sentinel. The dog had barely left her side for the past 72 hours, his protective instincts operating at full capacity. Downstairs, Agent Reeves reviewed overnight developments with her team. They had identified one of the kidnappers through facial recognition. His name was Viktor Sokolov, a Ukrainian national with a criminal record in 3 countries, including extortion, armed robbery, and kidnapping. He had entered the United States 6 months ago on a tourist visa and had not left. The identification gives us a significant lead, Reeves explained to Margaret and Marcus over morning coffee. We're tracking his known associates, reviewing his movements through immigration records, checking rental agreements and property transactions. We're also monitoring international wire transfers that might connect to his network. Will you find my husband before midnight? Margaret asked directly. Reeves hesitated, then answered honestly. The probability decreases with each passing hour. Professional kidnapping operations typically involve secure locations that are difficult to trace. However, we're pursuing every avenue simultaneously. The ransom money sat in 3 duffel bags in Richard's study, guarded by 2 FBI agents, $10 million in cash, marked bills, with tracking devices embedded in the lining of each bag. The money represented years of Richard's work, decades of building his business from a single construction project into a regional empire. David Chen arrived at 9 a.m. with final legal documents. If the ransom was paid, the company would need to report the loss, work with insurance companies, and potentially face regulatory scrutiny. The legal complications stretched beyond the immediate crisis. Marcus stood at the window of his father's study, watching Atlas patrol the grounds. The dog moved with purpose, checking the perimeter, investigating any unusual sounds or movements. Marcus envied the dog's clarity of purpose, his ability to act on instinct without the paralysis of overthinking. "I'm making the delivery," Marcus said again, his voice firm. "Final decision." Margaret looked at her son, seeing Richard in his determined expression. "The FBI should handle it. They can follow me, protect me from a distance, but the kidnapper specified one person alone. No visible law enforcement. If they see a convoy, they'll disappear and we'll never see Dad again." Marcus turned from the window. "I need to do this, Mom, please." Agent Torres entered the study. "We've located a possible holding location, an abandoned industrial property in Fontana that matches several parameters from the van's trajectory analysis. We're preparing a tactical team for reconnaissance." Hope flared in Margaret's chest. "How certain are you?" 40% confidence, Torres admitted. "The property was recently leased through a shell corporation that matches financial patterns associated with organized crime. However, we cannot confirm Richard's presence without direct surveillance or entry." 40%. Not enough certainty to risk Richard's life with a premature raid, but enough to justify investigation. Meanwhile, in his concrete room, Richard had developed a routine to maintain sanity. He exercised, doing push-ups and stretches within the limited range his chain allowed. He counted his breaths, practiced meditation techniques he had learned years ago during a wellness retreat Margaret had convinced him to attend. He thought about his family, about the life he would reclaim once this nightmare ended. The older man visited again around noon. He seemed pleased, his demeanor more relaxed than previous visits. "Your family has assembled the ransom," he said. "The delivery will occur tonight. By this time tomorrow you will be home with your wife and children." "How do I know you'll honor that promise?" Richard asked. "Reputation," the man said simply. "In our profession, reputation determines future success. If we killed clients after receiving payment, our business model would collapse. Word spreads even in criminal circles. We have released 17 previous clients unharmed. You will be the 18th. 17 previous victims." Richard wondered how many families had endured what his family was enduring now. How many people had sat in this same concrete room, chained to the same floorbolt, waiting for ransom negotiations to conclude. "What happens to you?" Richard asked. "Eventually law enforcement will identify you, track you down." The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble driveway of the Henderson estate in Palisades, California. Richard Henderson stood at his study window, coffee in hand, watching his German Shepherd Atlas perform his morning patrol of the property. The dog moved with precise, calculated steps, his dark coat gleaming in the early light. Richard had purchased Atlas 2 years ago from a specialized training facility in North Hollywood for $75,000. His wife Margaret had called it excessive, but Richard knew better. In their neighborhood, where homes sold for 8 figures and celebrity break-ins made weekly headlines, Atlas was an investment in peace of mind. At 53, Richard had built his fortune in commercial real estate development. His company owned shopping centers across the western states, and his net worth had recently crossed $200 million. Success brought visibility, and visibility brought risks he never imagined when he started his first construction project 3 decades ago. Margaret entered the study, her silk robe flowing behind her. She had aged gracefully, her blonde hair now touched with silver at the temples. 25 years of marriage had weathered storms most couples never survived. Their daughter Emily was finishing her junior year at Stanford, and their son Marcus worked in Richard's company, learning the business from the ground up. "You're thinking about the Thompson kidnapping again," Margaret said, not as a question but as a statement. She knew her husband's worried expressions better than he knew them himself. Richard nodded. 3 months ago, David Thompson, another real estate developer he knew from industry conferences, had been taken from his car outside a Beverly Hills restaurant. The kidnappers demanded $5 million. David was released after 4 days, but the psychological scars remained visible. He had aged 10 years in those 4 days. "Atlas will keep us safe," Margaret said, moving beside him at the window. The dog had stopped near the gate, his ears perked at something beyond the property line. Richard wanted to believe that. Atlas was not just any guard dog. He had been bred from champion German Shepherd bloodlines and trained for 18 months in protection work. The dog could differentiate between threats and guests, could attack on command, and more importantly, could restrain himself when ordered. His training had included scenarios ranging from home invasions to public confrontations. "I have the meeting downtown at 10, Richard said, checking his watch. "The Riverside project. If we close this deal, it'll be the biggest acquisition we've made." Margaret touched his arm. "Take Marcus with you, and John can drive." John was their security consultant, a former police officer who occasionally accompanied Richard to high-stakes meetings. "I don't want to live in fear," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. Fear had become a constant companion since the Thompson incident. Every dark parking garage, every unfamiliar face in a crowd, every car that seemed to follow too closely on the highway triggered his anxiety. The doorbell rang. Atlas immediately moved toward the front of the house, his posture shifting from relaxed to alert. Richard appreciated the dog's instant response. This was why he had spent so much money on a protection animal, rather than simply installing more cameras. Through the security monitor, Richard saw Marcus at the gate. His son had his mother's features but his father's build, tall and broad-shouldered. At 26, Marcus showed promise in the business, though he still had much to learn about reading people and spotting opportunities. Richard buzzed him through. Atlas maintained his alert stance until Marcus entered, then relaxed when the dog recognized the familiar scent and face. The animal's ability to assess situations impressed Richard daily. "Ready for the meeting?" Marcus asked, carrying a leather portfolio. "I reviewed the Riverside numbers again last night. The property is undervalued by at least 20%. If we can negotiate the zoning changes, we're looking at triple the returns within 5 years." Richard smiled. His son had inherited his analytical mind. "Good. Let's make this happen." They spent the next hour reviewing documents in the study. Margaret brought fresh coffee and pastries from the bakery she favored in Santa Monica. Atlas settled near Richard's desk, his eyes half closed but his ears still tracking every sound in the house. At 9:30, Richard changed into his meeting suit, a tailored charcoal gray with a blue tie Margaret had given him for his birthday. He looked at himself in the mirror, noting the gray at his temples, the lines around his eyes that deepened each year. Success had its price, and lately, that price felt heavier. John arrived at 9:45 in the black Escalade they used for business trips. He was a solid man in his 50s, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in law enforcement. He carried himself with quiet confidence that Richard found reassuring. "Traffic looks clear," John said, checking his phone. "Should make it downtown in 40 minutes. Richard kissed Margaret goodbye. She held him longer than usual, and he felt her concern in the embrace. "Be careful," she whispered. Atlas walked them to the door, his tail wagging slightly as Richard patted his head. The dog would remain here guarding Margaret and the house. For a moment, Richard considered bringing Atlas along, but the dog's primary job was protecting his home and family. The Escalade pulled through the gates, and Richard watched his house recede in the side mirror. The Spanish-style mansion had been their home for 8 years, every room filled with memories of family dinners, holiday celebrations, and quiet evenings by the fireplace. He loved this place, this life they had built together. Marcus reviewed documents on his tablet, occasionally making notes with a stylus. Richard admired his son's focus. In another decade, Marcus would likely run the company, and Richard could finally consider retirement. Perhaps travel with Margaret like they had always planned. The Escalade merged onto the Pacific Coast Highway, the ocean stretching endlessly to their right. Richard allowed himself to relax slightly, letting the rhythmic sound of tires on pavement lull his anxious mind. Everything would be fine. This was just another business meeting in a career filled with them. He had no way of knowing that in less than 2 hours, his entire world would shatter. The meeting took place in a high-rise office building in downtown Los Angeles. Richard and Marcus spent 90 minutes negotiating with the Riverside property owners, a family trust looking to liquidate assets after the patriarch's death. The numbers worked, the terms were favorable, and by 11:30 they had a handshake agreement worth $42 million. "That went better than expected," Marcus said as they rode the elevator down. "The zoning variants should be straightforward. We can break ground by spring." Richard allowed himself a rare smile. This deal would add significant value to their portfolio and create jobs in an economically depressed area. He believed in development that served communities, not just profit margins. John was waiting in the parking structure, the Escalade idling near the elevator bay. Richard noticed John's eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, a habit from his law enforcement years. The underground garage was dim despite overhead lights, with concrete pillars creating shadows between parked vehicles. They were 10 feet from the Escalade when it happened. A white van screeched around the corner, blocking their path. Doors flew open and 4 men in dark clothing and ski masks jumped out. Richard's mind barely registered the scene before one of them shoved something hard against John's back. "Nobody moves," the man said, his voice muffled by the mask. He held a pistol. Richard's blood ran cold. This was not happening. Not here, not now. His mind flashed to Margaret and Atlas, to Emily at Stanford, to all the security measures that had failed to prevent this moment. "Keys," another masked man demanded, grabbing John's shoulder. John hesitated and the man struck him across the face with the pistol. John staggered, blood streaming from his nose. "Dad," Marcus started to move, but Richard grabbed his arm. "Do what they say," Richard whispered. Every kidnapping awareness seminar he had attended stressed compliance. Survival first, everything else later. The men moved with practiced efficiency. 2 grabbed Richard, zip-tying his hands behind his back. Another secured Marcus the same way. John received the same treatment, though he continued bleeding from his broken nose. "Phone," one demanded, patting Richard down. He found Richard's iPhone and threw it to the ground, crushing it under his boot. They did the same with Marcus's phone and John's. "In the van. Now." They were shoved toward the vehicle. Richard stumbled but caught himself. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. Every fear he had harbored since the Thompson kidnapping was manifesting in real time. The man smiled. "Eventually, perhaps. But we are patient, careful, and well-resourced. We operate across international borders. We use sophisticated financial instruments to launder payments. We employ counter-surveillance techniques learned from military and intelligence operations. The FBI is competent, but we have advantages they do not." After he left, Richard thought about those advantages. International operations made jurisdictional cooperation difficult. Money laundering through cryptocurrency and offshore accounts complicated financial tracking. Professional training gave the kidnappers tactical skills matching or exceeding law enforcement capabilities. Back at the Henderson estate, the tactical team reported from Fontana. They had surveilled the industrial property for 2 hours. No activity, no vehicles, no signs of occupation. The lead had not panned out. Agent Reeves's expression showed frustration, but she maintained professional composure. "We continue investigating," she said. "We have 8 hours until the delivery deadline. Other leads may develop." But everyone in the room understood the probability was shifting toward ransom payment as the primary resolution path. The FBI's investigative capabilities were formidable, but the kidnappers had planned well, covered their tracks and maintained operational discipline. Marcus loaded the 3 duffel bags into his Range Rover at 10 p.m. The vehicle had been selected because it had off-road capabilities for the forest location and no obvious modifications that might signal law enforcement involvement. Agent Torres had installed additional tracking devices in the vehicle, hidden in multiple locations throughout the chassis and interior. "We'll have units positioned at distance," Reeves explained, showing Marcus a map with marked locations. "You'll wear a wire, but if they detect it, claim the FBI insisted and you had no choice. Emphasize your family's cooperation, your desire for your father's safe return." Margaret helped Marcus into the Kevlar vest under his jacket. Her hands shook as she adjusted the straps. "Be careful," she whispered. "Come home safe, both of you." Atlas watched the preparations from nearby, his ears alert, his posture suggesting awareness that something significant was occurring. Margaret had decided to bring the dog along for the wait at the estate. His presence comforted her, provided stability in chaos. At 11 p.m., Marcus drove through the estate gates toward the Angeles National Forest. The route would take approximately 40 minutes, putting him at the GPS coordinates with 20 minutes to spare before the midnight deadline. The forest road was dark, illuminated only by his headlights. Pine trees crowded close on both sides. Marcus's heart pounded, adrenaline sharpening his senses. In his earpiece, Agent Torres provided quiet updates about FBI units positioned at various points along the route. The GPS coordinates led to a small clearing off the main fire road. Marcus parked as instructed, leaving the engine running, the headlights illuminating the trees ahead. He waited, scanning the darkness beyond his lights, seeing nothing but forest shadows. At precisely midnight, his phone rang. Unknown number. Exit the vehicle, the voice on the phone instructed. Leave the keys in the ignition, the engine running, the headlights on. Place the 3 bags in the center of the clearing. Walk back to your vehicle and drive away immediately. Do not look back. Do not stop until you reach the main highway. Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he opened the door. The forest air was cold, pine-scented, absolutely silent except for his vehicle's engine. He retrieved the 3 duffel bags from the back seat, each one heavy with cash and tracking devices. In his earpiece, Agent Torres whispered, "We have thermal imaging. No visual on any individuals within 200 yards of your location. They're watching remotely, probably through cameras. Stay calm." Marcus carried the bags to the clearing center, his boots crunching on pine needles and small stones. He placed the bags side by side, then straightened and returned to his Range Rover. Every instinct screamed at him to look around, to search the darkness for watchers, but he forced himself to maintain forward focus. He climbed back into the driver's seat, shifted into reverse, and backed onto the fire road. Then he drove forward, descending the mountain road toward the highway. His phone rang again after 5 minutes. "Your father will be released at sunrise at the following coordinates," the voice said, then provided a GPS location near Palmdale, approximately 60 miles away. "He will be unharmed. Do not attempt to intercept the ransom recovery. Any law enforcement presence in the drop zone will result in immediate termination of our agreement." The call ended. Marcus pulled over at a turnout and relayed the information to Agent Torres. FBI units were already mobilizing toward Palmdale while other teams maintained distant surveillance of the Angeles National Forest drop site. "The tracking devices are active," Torres reported. "The bags are stationary at the drop location. We're maintaining visual distance as instructed. If they move the money, we'll follow at maximum range." Marcus drove back to the Henderson estate, arriving at 2 a.m. Margaret waited in the study with Reeves and David Chen. Atlas lifted his head when Marcus entered but remained close to Margaret's chair. "They said sunrise in Palmdale," Marcus reported. "They promised he'd be unharmed." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Relief mixed with continued anxiety. Richard was not home yet. The kidnappers could still change their plans, could still betray the agreement. Nothing was certain until he was physically safe. "We'll have units in Palmdale within 30 minutes, Reeves said. "Covert positions, no visible law enforcement presence. If Richard appears at the specified location, we'll confirm his condition before moving in for recovery." The hours until sunrise stretched endlessly. Margaret made coffee, nobody drank. Marcus sat beside his mother, both of them watching the clock, counting minutes. Atlas remained alert, sensing the tension in his pack, maintaining his protective vigil. In the Angeles National Forest, FBI surveillance teams watched the clearing through thermal imaging and night vision equipment. At 3:15 a.m., 2 figures approached the drop site on foot, moving through the forest with tactical precision. They retrieved the 3 duffel bags and retreated the way they had come. The tracking devices transmitted their signals. The figures carried the bags approximately half a mile to a vehicle parked on an access road. The vehicle departed, heading east. FBI units followed at extreme distance, using helicopter support and satellite tracking to maintain surveillance without detection. Meanwhile, Richard sat in the back of a different vehicle, still hooded, his hands zip-tied again. They had moved him from the concrete room an hour ago, walking him to what felt like a garage, loading him into what he assumed was a van based on the interior space and engine sound. The vehicle drove for what Richard estimated was 90 minutes. The motion eventually lulled him into a semi-conscious state, exhaustion from 3 days of stress finally overwhelming his hypervigilance. He jerked awake when the vehicle stopped, hands guided him out. His feet found dirt and gravel. They walked him forward perhaps 20 steps, then stopped. Someone cut the zip ties on his wrists, then they removed the hood. Richard blinked in dim pre-dawn light. He stood in an empty dirt lot surrounded by scrub brush and desert landscape. A single road stretched away in both directions. No buildings were visible, no landmarks, nothing but desert extending to distant mountains. The van was already pulling away, its taillights receding into darkness. He was alone, free, alive. Richard's legs nearly collapsed. He stood there in the growing light, breathing deeply, letting the reality settle over him. The kidnappers had honored their agreement. They had released him unharmed after receiving payment. Professional criminals maintaining their reputation for future operations. Movement caught his eye. A vehicle approached from the south, headlights cutting through the dawn. Richard tensed, wondering if the kidnappers had returned, if this was some cruel trick. But the vehicle was a black SUV, and when it stopped, FBI agents emerged with weapons drawn. "Richard Henderson?" one agent called out. "Yes," Richard said, his voice cracking from disuse. "Yes, that's me." They surrounded him quickly, efficiently, checking him for injuries, scanning the area for threats. Someone draped a blanket over his shoulders. Someone else offered water. Richard drank gratefully, the liquid soothing his dry throat. "Your family is waiting," Agent Reeves said, appearing from the SUV. "Let's get you home." The drive back to Palisades took 2 hours through morning traffic. Richard sat in the back seat answering questions, providing descriptions of the kidnappers, details about the holding location, anything that might help the FBI. Investigation. But mostly he just stared out the window at the familiar Los Angeles landscape, grateful to see it again. The SUV pulled through the gates of his estate at 8:30 a.m. Richard saw Margaret and Marcus waiting on the driveway, and emotion overwhelmed him. The agents opened his door and he stepped out into morning sunlight. Margaret ran to him and they collided in an embrace that felt like coming home after years rather than days. She was crying and Richard realized he was crying too. Marcus joined them, his arms wrapping around both parents, and they stood there together, a family reunited. Atlas approached more cautiously. The dog had been trained to recognize Richard, but 3 days of absence had disrupted the pack dynamic. Atlas circled the reunion, tail wagging tentatively, nose working to confirm familiar scents. When Richard knelt and extended his hand, Atlas moved forward and pressed his head against Richard's chest. "Good boy," Richard whispered, stroking the dog's dark fur. "Good boy, Atlas." They moved inside. Margaret had prepared breakfast, though Richard found he had little appetite. He was too exhausted, too emotionally wrung out. He showered, washing away 3 days of captivity, then collapsed into his own bed with Margaret beside him. He slept until late afternoon, dreamless and deep. When he woke, sunlight slanted through the bedroom windows and Atlas lay on the floor beside the bed, still maintaining his protective watch. Richard reached down and touched the dog's head, grateful for the animal's presence, for the security Atlas represented. Downstairs, the FBI continued their investigation. The tracking devices had led them to an abandoned warehouse in San Bernardino, where the duffel bags had been found empty, the cash removed, the tracking devices disabled. The kidnappers had swept for electronic surveillance and methodically removed any evidence. Viktor Sokolov had disappeared. His last known address was vacant. His phone was disconnected. The other kidnappers remained unidentified. The FBI had descriptions, partial fingerprints from the kidnapping site, and Richard's testimony, but professional criminals left minimal traces. Richard knew the investigation would continue for months, possibly years. But for now, he was home. He was safe. His family was intact. The $10 million was gone, but money could be replaced. What mattered was that he had survived, that he had been given a second chance at the life he had built. That evening, the family gathered for dinner. Emily had driven down from Stanford. They sat around the dining table, Atlas lying near Richard's chair, and they talked about normal things. Classes and business deals and weekend plans. Nobody mentioned concrete rooms or ransom demands or midnight deliveries in dark forests. Later, Richard stood at his study window with a glass of whiskey, watching Atlas patrol the grounds in the gathering darkness. The dog moved with confidence, checking the perimeter, protecting his territory and his pack. Richard had spent $75,000 on that protection, and now he understood it was worth far more. The weeks following Richard's return brought a slow return to normalcy, though the experience had left marks on the entire family. Richard struggled with sleep, often waking in the night from dreams of concrete rooms and masked figures. Margaret watched him with concerned eyes, and Atlas seemed to sense his alpha's distress, staying closer than usual during these difficult nights. The FBI investigation continued with methodical determination. Agent Reeves visited weekly with updates. They had traced some of the ransom money through international wire transfers and cryptocurrency exchanges, But the trail grew cold and offshore accounts registered to shell corporations. Viktor Sokolov remained at large, likely having left the country within hours of the ransom delivery. Professional operations like this are designed to be nearly impossible to fully dismantle, Reeves explained during one visit. We've identified members of the network, but the leadership maintains distance from actual operations. They use independent contractors, compartmentalized information, and sophisticated financial instruments that cross multiple jurisdictions. Richard found himself becoming hyper-aware of his surroundings. He noticed cars that seemed to follow too closely on the highway. He scrutinized strangers in parking garages. He insisted that John accompany him to every business meeting, and he purchased additional security systems for the estate. Atlas became more than just a guard dog. Richard spent time training with the dog, reinforcing commands, building their bond. The specialized trainer who had originally prepared Atlas came to the estate twice weekly to work with both Richard and the dog, teaching advanced protection techniques and communication methods. Atlas already knows how to protect you, the trainer explained. A weathered man named Carlos who had spent 20 years in military dog handling. But now you need to learn how to work with him effectively. A protection dog is only as good as the handler's ability to read and direct him. They practiced scenarios. Carlos would approach aggressively, and Richard would give Atlas commands to alert, to threaten, to restrain. The dog responded with precision, his training evident in every movement. Richard felt safer knowing Atlas could differentiate between genuine threats and normal social interactions. Marcus struggled with guilt. He had witnessed his father's abduction and felt powerless to prevent it. He threw himself into work, taking on additional projects at the company, as if professional success could somehow compensate for his perceived failure during the kidnapping. "You saved my life," Richard told his son during a quiet conversation in his study. "You delivered the ransom. You followed their instructions. You brought me home. That took courage, Marcus. I stood there frozen while they took you," Marcus said, his voice tight with emotion. "John went for his weapon and I just watched." "You stayed alive," Richard said firmly. "You protected yourself so you could help your mother, coordinate with the FBI, and ultimately ensure my release. That was exactly what you should have done." The conversation helped, but Richard knew Marcus would carry the memory for years. Trauma had a way of embedding itself deep, reshaping how people viewed the world and their place in it. Emily returned to Stanford after 2 weeks at home. She called daily, checking on her father, maintaining connection even from a distance. Richard appreciated her concern but encouraged her to focus on her studies, to live her life without constant anxiety about his safety. The business recovered more quickly than the family. The Riverside deal closed successfully, and Richard's company continued expanding despite the $10 million loss from the ransom payment. Insurance covered a portion, and the company's strong financial position absorbed the remaining impact. But Richard found himself questioning his priorities. He had built an empire, accumulated enormous wealth, and in doing so had made himself a target. The kidnapping had been purely financial, professionals selecting him based on spreadsheet analysis of net worth and ransom feasibility. "I'm considering retiring early," he told Margaret one evening as they sat on their patio watching the sunset. Atlas lay nearby, his eyes half closed but his ears still tracking sounds from beyond the property line. Margaret looked at him with surprise. "You love your work. I love my life more," Richard said. "I love you, our children, our home." The business was supposed to provide security and opportunity. Instead, it nearly got me killed. They discussed the possibility over several weeks. Richard could step back, let Marcus run daily operations while Richard maintained advisory oversight. They could travel, spend time with Emily at Stanford, pursue hobbies and interests they had postponed for decades. The decision crystallized during a routine business trip downtown. Richard was reviewing documents in the back of the Escalade when a white van pulled alongside them at a stoplight. His heart rate spiked instantly. His hands began shaking. John noticed his reaction and immediately changed routes, taking alternative streets back to the estate. Post-traumatic stress, the therapist Margaret convinced Richard to see explained. "Your brain associates white vans with mortal danger now. That's a normal response to life-threatening trauma. Over time, with treatment, the reaction will diminish but may never fully disappear." Richard started therapy twice weekly. He learned breathing techniques for managing panic responses. He practiced mindfulness meditation. He joined a support group for kidnapping survivors, where he met others who understood the unique psychological impact of being held captive. Atlas became part of Richard's therapeutic routine. The dog's presence provided measurable stress reduction. Studies had shown that trained protection dogs offered not just physical security, but psychological comfort to their handlers. Simply having Atlas nearby lowered Richard's baseline anxiety levels. 3 months after the kidnapping, Richard announced his semi-retirement at a company meeting. Marcus would become CEO, with Richard serving as board chairman and strategic advisor. The transition would occur over 6 months, allowing Marcus to fully assume leadership while Richard remained available for consultation. The decision felt right. Richard found peace in letting go of daily operational stress, in trusting his son to lead the company into its next phase. He and Margaret began planning a European trip, something they had discussed for years but never prioritized. The FBI investigation produced one significant breakthrough in the 4th month. German authorities arrested Viktor Sokolov in Berlin, attempting to use falsified identity documents. He was extradited to the United States to face federal kidnapping charges. 2 other members of the network were arrested in connection with Sokolov's operation. Richard attended Sokolov's arraignment, sitting in the gallery with Margaret beside him and Atlas at his feet. The courtroom allowed service animals, and Richard had obtained certification for Atlas as an emotional support animal, which gave the dog access to public spaces that normally prohibited pets. Sokolov looked smaller in the courtroom than Richard remembered from the kidnapping. The man appeared tired, defeated, nothing like the confident professional who had executed the abduction with military precision. The federal prosecutor outlined charges carrying potential sentences exceeding 30 years. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked Richard as they left the courthouse. "Relieved," Richard admitted. "Not fully healed, but relieved that there's accountability, that he'll face consequences for what he did to us." Justice moved slowly. The trial would take months or years to conclude, with procedural delays and legal maneuvering extending the process. But Richard no longer felt defined by the kidnapping. He was a survivor, not a victim. He was rebuilding his life on his own terms. 6 months after the kidnapping, Richard and Margaret's lives had settled into a new rhythm. The European trip had been postponed when Richard realized he was not yet ready for international travel. The thought of foreign airports, unfamiliar cities, and being far from his security network triggered anxiety he could not fully suppress. Instead, they focused on smaller changes closer to home. Richard spent more time at the estate, working from his study rather than commuting downtown daily. Marcus managed the company capably, consulting with Richard on major decisions but handling day-to-day operations independently. The transition was working better than Richard had anticipated. Atlas remained central to Richard's daily routine. The dog accompanied him on morning walks around the property, sat beside his desk during work hours, and slept in the master bedroom at night. The bond between man and dog had deepened through shared experience and consistent interaction. Carlos, the dog trainer, continued weekly sessions but shifted focus from protection scenarios to more advanced communication and bonding exercises. "Atlas understands you now at a level most handlers never achieve with their dogs," Carlos explained during one session. "He reads your body language, your stress levels, your emotional state. This connection makes him more effective as a protection animal, but also as a companion." Richard appreciated the dual role. Atlas provided security, but more importantly, the dog offered unconditional presence. There were no questions about the kidnapping, no concerned looks, no well-meaning but exhausting sympathy. Just steady companionship. Margaret noticed the change in her husband. The nightmares decreased in frequency and intensity. Richard's hypervigilance remained but became more manageable. He could drive past white vans without full panic attacks, though he still experienced elevated heart rate and increased alertness. The therapy continued weekly. Richard's therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, specialized in post-traumatic stress and helped him develop coping mechanisms for managing anxiety triggers. They worked on cognitive reframing, challenging the catastrophic thinking that had dominated Richard's mental patterns since the kidnapping. "You survived something that would break many people," Dr. Chen told him during one session. The fact that you're still functioning, still working, still maintaining relationships demonstrates remarkable resilience. The anxiety is your mind's way of trying to protect you from future threats. It's not weakness. It's a survival mechanism that's currently overactive. Understanding the neurological basis for his reactions helped Richard feel less ashamed of his limitations. He was not weak or broken. His brain had adapted to survive extreme stress, and now it needed time and guidance to recalibrate for normal life. Emily visited more frequently from Stanford, often bringing friends who provided welcome distraction from family intensity. Richard enjoyed these visits, appreciated the energy and normalcy that came with young people discussing classes and internships and future plans. Life continued beyond his personal trauma. Marcus had grown into his leadership role. He made decisions with confidence, handled difficult negotiations skillfully, and earned respect from employees and business partners. Richard felt pride watching his son navigate challenges that would have once required paternal intervention. "You're doing better than I did at your age," Richard told Marcus after his son successfully closed a particularly complex development deal. "You have instincts that took me years to develop." Marcus smiled, but Richard saw the shadow that still crossed his son's face when the kidnapping came up in any context. They were all still healing, all still processing what had happened and what it meant for their future. The FBI investigation reached a milestone when 2 additional suspects were arrested in connection with the kidnapping network. The arrests came from information Viktor Sokolov provided as part of a plea negotiation. He agreed to testify against the network's leadership in exchange for reduced sentencing. Agent Reeves visited to update Richard on the developments. "We believe we've identified the older man who held you," she explained, showing Richard a photograph. "His name is Anton Volkov, Russian national, former military intelligence officer. He's currently believed to be in Moscow beyond our extradition reach." Richard studied the photograph. The man looked older than Richard remembered, but the eyes were the same. Cold, calculating, professional. What happens now? Sokolov's testimony may lead to additional arrests of network operatives still in the United States. The investigation has also provided intelligence to other agencies pursuing similar operations in Europe and Latin America. Your case is part of a larger pattern of professional kidnapping for ransom, targeting high-net-worth individuals globally. The knowledge that his experience contributed to broader law enforcement efforts provided some comfort. Perhaps his suffering would prevent others from experiencing similar trauma. Richard began speaking at security conferences for business executives. He shared his story, explaining how professional criminal networks identified targets, planned operations, and executed kidnappings despite security measures. His presentations emphasized practical steps companies and individuals could take to reduce vulnerability. "I was selected because my profile indicated sufficient wealth to pay ransom, predictable routines that allowed planning, and security measures that were adequate against opportunistic crime, but insufficient against professional operations," Richard explained during one presentation. "They studied me for weeks or months before the abduction. They knew my schedule, my family structure, my financial capacity. The presentations were therapeutic. Transforming his victimization into educational content gave Richard agency over his narrative. He was no longer just someone who had been kidnapped. He was someone who survived, learned, and now helped others avoid similar experiences. Atlas attended these presentations with Richard, lying quietly beside the podium. Several attendees approached afterward to ask about protection dogs, intrigued by the visible security and comfort Atlas provided. Richard shared Carlos's contact information, encouraging executives to consider professionally trained animals as part of comprehensive security planning. The financial recovery continued steadily. Insurance payments, asset liquidation reversals, and strong business performance restored the company's reserves. The $10 million ransom became an expensive but survivable business expense rather than a crippling loss. Richard donated to organizations supporting kidnapping victims and their families. He learned about groups providing psychological support, legal assistance, and financial guidance to people navigating post-kidnapping recovery. His donations funded therapy services and security consulting for families who lacked his financial resources. "Money can't fix what happened," he told Margaret, as they reviewed charitable giving for the year. "But it can help others cope with similar trauma." Margaret had been remarkably resilient throughout the ordeal. She had maintained composure during the kidnapping, coordinated with law enforcement, supported Marcus and Emily, and then helped Richard through his recovery. But Richard noticed signs of delayed stress emerging as his own condition improved. She startled easily at unexpected sounds. She checked security cameras obsessively. She called Richard multiple times daily when he traveled, even short local trips. Dr. Chen recommended that Margaret also consider therapy, acknowledging that family members often experienced secondary trauma from kidnapping events. "I thought I was fine," Margaret admitted during a difficult conversation. "I focused on getting you home, on keeping the family together, on managing the crisis. Now that things are calmer, I feel everything I suppressed during those 3 days." They attended several therapy sessions together, working through the shared trauma and its impact on their marriage. The experience had changed both of them, and they needed to learn how to relate to each other as the people they had become, rather than who they had been before the kidnapping. Atlas, ever perceptive, adjusted his behavior to support both Richard and Margaret. The dog divided his attention between them, offering comfort to whoever showed more stress in any given moment. Richard marveled at the animal's emotional intelligence, his ability to sense and respond to human needs without verbal communication. 1 year after the kidnapping, the Henderson family gathered at the estate to mark the anniversary. It was not a celebration, but an acknowledgement, a moment to reflect on how far they had come and how much they had changed. Richard stood on the patio watching the sunset, Atlas beside him as always, and felt a complex mixture of gratitude and sorrow. The therapy had helped tremendously. Dr. Chen had guided Richard through processing the trauma, reframing his relationship with fear, and developing strategies for managing ongoing anxiety. He still had difficult days, moments when memories surfaced unbidden, but these episodes decreased in frequency and intensity. Margaret had made similar progress with her own therapist. She had worked through the secondary trauma of witnessing her husband's suffering, the guilt of feeling helpless during the kidnapping, and the adjustment to their changed relationship dynamic. They attended couples therapy monthly, maintaining the connection they had rebuilt in the aftermath. Marcus had finally accepted that he bore no responsibility for the kidnapping. His guilt had gradually transformed into determination, driving his success as CEO while no longer consuming him with self-recrimination. He had started dating seriously for the first time since the incident, allowing himself emotional vulnerability he had previously suppressed. Emily had returned to Stanford and thrived. She maintained closer contact with her family than before, calling several times weekly and visiting monthly. The kidnapping had reshaped her understanding of life's fragility and the importance of maintaining relationships while opportunity existed. The FBI investigation had concluded with mixed results. Viktor Sokolov received a 28-year federal sentence for his role in the kidnapping. 2 accomplices received shorter sentences. Anton Volkov remained in Russia, beyond American jurisdiction, but now identified and monitored by international law enforcement agencies. Agent Reeves had visited Richard one final time to close the case officially. "We recovered approximately $2 million of the $10 million ransom through international financial tracking," she explained. "The rest disappeared through cryptocurrency exchanges and offshore accounts. We've disrupted this particular network, but others continue operating." Richard had accepted this outcome. Complete justice was impossible in cases involving international criminal organizations. What mattered was that he had survived. His family was safe, and future potential victims might benefit from intelligence gathered during the investigation. His speaking engagements had evolved into a regular consulting practice. Richard advised corporations on executive security, threat assessment, and crisis management. He brought real-world experience that complemented theoretical security protocols. His presentations now included detailed case studies drawn from his ordeal. Atlas accompanied Richard to every engagement, serving as both protection and therapeutic support. The dog had become somewhat famous in security circles, with articles written about the role protection animals played in executive security programs. Several clients had contacted Carlos about acquiring and training similar dogs. The Henderson estate itself had undergone security upgrades. Richard had installed additional cameras, upgraded perimeter fencing, and implemented access control systems that would have prevented or at least complicated his kidnapping. He recognized that determined professionals could overcome almost any security, But layered defenses increased difficulty and reduced vulnerability. The financial recovery was complete. The company had not only absorbed the ransom loss, but had grown substantially under Marcus's leadership. The Riverside project proved enormously profitable, validating the deal Richard had closed hours before his abduction. Insurance settlements and recovered funds further eased the financial impact. But money was no longer Richard's primary focus. The kidnapping had fundamentally altered his perspective on wealth, success, and life priorities. He and Margaret had simplified their lives, reducing material possessions, declining social obligations that felt performative rather than meaningful, and focusing on experiences over acquisitions. They had finally taken the European trip, spending 3 weeks traveling through Italy and France. Richard experienced anxiety in foreign airports and unfamiliar cities, but he managed it with the tools Dr. Chen had taught him. Atlas could not accompany them internationally, which initially concerned Richard, but he found he could cope without the dog's physical presence. Upon returning, Richard appreciated Atlas's greeting with new depth. The dog's excitement at his return, the way Atlas refused to leave his side for days afterward, reminded Richard of the importance of loyalty and unconditional acceptance. These qualities seemed increasingly rare in human relationships but remained constant in his bond with the animal. Richard had reconnected with David Thompson, the real estate developer whose kidnapping had initially heightened Richard's anxiety before his own abduction. They met for lunch quarterly, two men who shared an experience few could understand. Thompson had recovered more slowly, his kidnapping lasting longer and involving more traumatic treatment. "You had advantages I didn't," Thompson explained during one lunch. "Your family paid quickly. The FBI was involved from the beginning and you were released unharmed. My kidnapping dragged on for weeks. They moved me multiple times. The psychological manipulation was intense." Richard felt gratitude for the relatively professional nature of his own kidnapping while recognizing the absurdity of comparing traumas. Both experiences were devastating. Both left permanent marks. The differences in degree did not change the fundamental violation of being held captive. The support group Richard attended included individuals with varied kidnapping experiences. Some had been held for months. Others had been tourists in foreign countries when abducted. A few were family members of victims who had not survived. The group provided perspective and community, people who understood without needing extensive explanation. Richard had become a resource for newly released victims. Law enforcement and victim advocacy organizations occasionally referred recent survivors to him for peer support. He offered guidance drawn from his own recovery process, though he emphasized that everyone's journey was unique and required individualized approaches. One evening, Richard sat in his study reviewing financial documents while Atlas dozed nearby. Margaret entered with tea and sat beside him. They had developed new routines over the past year, small rituals that reinforced their connection and provided stability. "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" Margaret asked quietly. Richard considered the question carefully. "I wish I hadn't experienced the trauma. I wish our family hadn't suffered. But the person I've become since the kidnapping is in some ways better than who I was before. I'm more present, more grateful, more focused on what truly matters." Margaret nodded. She understood the paradox. Trauma was destructive, but recovery could be transformative. They were different people now. Their marriage different, their family dynamics altered. Not necessarily worse, just fundamentally changed. Richard reached down and stroked Atlas's head. The dog opened one eye, assessed that no threat existed, and returned to sleep. This simple exchange represented security, trust, and the everyday normalcy Richard had once taken for granted and now cherished. The anniversary dinner was quiet and intimate. Just family, no guests, no elaborate preparations. They shared memories of the difficult year, acknowledged their individual and collective growth, and expressed gratitude for their survival and recovery. Emily raised her glass for a toast. "To resilience," she said. "To family. To moving forward while honoring what we've been through." They drank to that sentiment. Richard felt emotion tighten his throat. His family had endured something that destroyed other families. They had survived not just the kidnapping itself, but the aftermath, the recovery process, the long adjustment to their new reality. Later that night, Richard walked the property with Atlas, making their final patrol before bed. The dog moved with familiar confidence, checking points along the perimeter they had established through repeated routine. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the grounds. Richard thought about the past year, about the journey from victim to survivor. The trauma would always be part of him, woven into his identity and worldview. But it no longer defined him completely. He was also a husband, father, businessman, and consultant. He was someone who had faced extreme adversity and chosen to rebuild rather than retreat. Atlas paused and looked back at Richard, waiting for his handler to catch up. Richard smiled and continued forward. They walked together through the quiet, night man and dog, both protectors and protected, both survivors of the year that had changed everything. 18 months after the kidnapping, Richard Henderson sat in a conference room in downtown Chicago, giving his most important presentation yet. The audience consisted of chief security officers from Fortune 500 companies, gathered for an international executive protection symposium. Atlas lay beside the podium, calm and alert, his presence both reassuring and illustrative of the points Richard was making. "The silent signal I gave during my captivity was unintentional," Richard explained, clicking to a slide showing a generic concrete room similar to where he had been held. "I had no opportunity to communicate with the outside world. No phone, no contact with anyone except my captors. But what I didn't know at the time was that my dog Atlas was providing a different kind of signal at home." He clicked to the next slide, showing a photograph of Atlas on alert. Protection dogs trained at the highest levels don't just respond to immediate threats. They respond to disruption in pack hierarchy, to changes in routine, to the absence of their bonded human. While I was in captivity, Atlas exhibited behavioral changes that my wife and security team recognized as significant. The audience leaned forward, interested. Richard had learned over dozens of presentations how to structure his narrative for maximum impact, building tension before revealing the resolution. After my release, my dog trainer explained that Atlas's behavior during those 3 days indicated extreme stress. The dog refused to eat normally, maintained constant vigilance beyond his training protocols, and showed agitation that my family had never witnessed before. In a sense, Atlas was signaling that something was fundamentally wrong with our family structure, even though he couldn't articulate what or how. Richard paused, letting the information settle. "This brings me to my central point about comprehensive security. Technical systems are crucial. Surveillance cameras, access controls, armored vehicles, professional security personnel, all of these matter. But biological security elements like trained protection animals provide capabilities that technology cannot replicate. They sense subtle environmental changes. They detect human stress and hostile intent. They provide psychological comfort that reduces the freeze response in crisis situations." He clicked through several slides showing statistics about executive kidnappings globally, recovery rates, and the effectiveness of various security measures. The data supported his arguments, but Richard knew his personal testimony carried more weight than any statistics. "My kidnapping was highly professional. The perpetrators studied me for weeks or months. They identified vulnerabilities in my routine, assessed my security measures, calculated the optimal abduction scenario, and executed flawlessly. Despite having a trained security driver, despite operating in downtown Los Angeles in broad daylight, despite my family's wealth enabling sophisticated protection, I was taken in less than 30 seconds. The room was silent. These security professionals understood the implications. If Richard Henderson, with his resources and awareness, could be kidnapped so easily, their own executives faced similar vulnerabilities. "But here's what the kidnappers didn't account for," Richard continued. "They planned for technological countermeasures. They planned for FBI involvement. They planned for financial tracking and surveillance. What they didn't fully consider was the human and animal elements. My family's resilience, my son's courage in delivering the ransom, the FBI agent's persistence despite jurisdictional limitations, and yes, Atlas's role in maintaining household stability during the crisis and supporting my recovery afterward." He clicked to a slide titled Integrated Security Approach and outlined recommendations drawn from his experience and subsequent consulting work. Layered technical systems, yes, but also psychological preparation for executives and families. trauma response planning, professional crisis management teams, and consideration of biological security elements like protection animals. The silent signal in my case wasn't something I consciously sent, Richard concluded. It was the absence I represented, the disruption my kidnapping caused in patterns and relationships and expectations. Atlas sensed it. My family felt it. And together, they worked with law enforcement to bring me home. No single element of security saved me. It was the integration of technical, human, and biological responses that ultimately resulted in my survival. The presentation ended to sustained applause. During the question period, Richard fielded inquiries about specific security protocols, psychological recovery processes, and the selection and training of protection animals. He answered with the authority of lived experience supplemented by 18 months of intensive research and consulting work. After the session, several executives approached him privately to discuss their own security concerns. Richard had learned to recognize the signs of people carrying trauma or fear they couldn't publicly acknowledge. He provided his contact information, offered to connect them with resources, and assured them that vulnerability was not weakness, but realistic assessment of genuine threats. That evening, Richard returned to his hotel room and video-called Margaret. She appeared on screen with Atlas visible in the background, the dog having positioned himself near the computer as if aware that Richard's voice was coming from that location. "How did it go?" Margaret asked. "Well," Richard said, "I think the message resonated. People are hungry for practical guidance based on real experience, not just theoretical security protocols." They talked for 30 minutes about the day's events, about Emily's latest call from Stanford where she was now in her senior year, about Marcus's successful navigation of a difficult merger negotiation. The conversation was comfortable, intimate, the kind of easy exchange that had taken months to rebuild after the kidnapping disrupted their communication patterns. After ending the call, Richard sat by the window, looking out at Chicago's skyline. He thought about the journey from that concrete room to this hotel suite, from victim to survivor to advocate. The trauma remained part of him, but it no longer controlled him. He had integrated the experience into a broader life narrative that included resilience, growth, and purpose. The next morning, Richard flew home to Los Angeles. Atlas greeted him at the door with characteristic enthusiasm, tail wagging, body vibrating with excitement. Richard knelt and embraced the dog, feeling the solid warmth of the animal, the unconditional joy of reunion. This greeting happened after every trip now, and Richard never took it for granted. Margaret emerged from the kitchen with coffee and her familiar smile. Marcus called from the office with questions about a property acquisition. Emily texted a photograph from a Stanford football game. Life continued in its beautiful, ordinary complexity. That afternoon, Richard and Atlas walked the property boundary as they did every day. The routine had become meditative, a time for Richard to process thoughts and emotions, while Atlas performed his security patrol. They moved in comfortable synchronization, man and dog, both protectors and both protected. Richard paused at his favorite spot overlooking the ocean. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. Atlas sat beside him, alert but relaxed, scanning the environment while remaining close to his handler. "We made it, buddy," Richard said quietly, stroking the dog's head. "We survived." Atlas glanced up at him, dark eyes reflecting intelligence and loyalty. The dog couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone, the emotion, the bond that had formed through shared experience and mutual dependence. He leaned against Richard's leg, solid and reassuring. Richard thought about the silent signal that had never been consciously sent, but had been received nonetheless. The signal was absence disruption, the breaking of patterns that defined normal life. His family had recognized it. Atlas had sensed it, and together, through integration of technology, human courage, animal intuition, and professional expertise, they had restored what had been broken. The journey wasn't over. Recovery from trauma was ongoing, not a destination but a process. Richard would continue therapy, continue speaking engagements, continue building the life he had reclaimed. But standing here with his dog, his family safe inside their home, the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly before him, Richard felt something approaching peace. Atlas suddenly tensed, his ears perking toward a sound beyond Richard's hearing. The dog remained still, assessing, determining whether the stimulus represented a threat. After a moment, Atlas relaxed, satisfied that no danger existed. Just a neighbor's car passing on the road beyond the property line. A normal sound in a normal evening. Richard smiled. This was what security meant. Not the absence of all possible threats, which was impossible, but the presence of vigilance, preparedness, and the ability to distinguish genuine danger from routine occurrences. Technology provided tools, training provided skills, but the bond between Richard and Atlas, between Richard and his family, provided something deeper and more enduring. They walked back toward the house together as the sun touched the horizon. Inside, lights glowed warm through windows. Margaret was preparing dinner. Marcus had said he might stop by after work. Emily would call later from Stanford. Life in all its precious, fragile, beautiful complexity continued. Richard opened the door, and Atlas trotted inside to check the interior perimeter before settling near the fireplace. Richard joined Margaret in the kitchen, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. She leaned back into the embrace, and they stood together in comfortable silence. The kidnapping had happened. The trauma was real. The scars remained. But so did love, resilience, and the determination to build meaning from suffering. Richard Henderson had given a silent signal in his absence. And what Atlas did next, along with his entire family, the FBI, and a network of support, had shocked everyone by demonstrating that even in the darkest circumstances, hope and connection could prevail. Outside, the last light faded from the sky. Inside, the Henderson family began another evening in their reclaimed life. And Atlas, faithful guardian and silent witness to their journey, maintained his watch over the pack he was trained to protect and had learned to love. The end.